It was interesting to listen to David. We discussed a little bit before that perhaps a lot of ours overlap, and indeed they do. Some of the findings that David talked about before are some of the things I will touch upon. If we look at safety management systems, which came into force mandatory in the mid-90s through the ISM Code, and has been expanded on ever since. And one of the complexities that we now face in the world, and again, David touched upon it, is email. If we look at the administrative burden on board our ships, it's become tremendously large. The way that they have to react, the speed at which they have to react. You know, we all have one of these. And it's a curse, because you get it 24 hours a day. Shipping is 24/7. The people on board ship, the same happens to them now. Before the invention of email, life was much simpler. Telex comes in, telex goes out the following day through the radio officer. Nowadays, they don't have a radio officer on board the ships. The captain, chief officer, chief engineer have to do all the administrative tasks. So what do we do as companies? We tend to give them more procedures to follow, more forms to fill out, more checklists to complete. Is that the best way to operate a ship safely? I don't think so. So what's wrong with our system? Now, I've touched a little bit that the complexities we have today on board the ships far exceed what they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So we need to make life easier for the people on board our ships. We've ended up with complicated, excessive documentation. When we have an incident on board our ships and we discover that they've not followed a procedure, what's the first thing we do? We write another procedure, or we make the procedure larger. Do we think that that resolves any of the problems? I don't think it does. To add to the complications, we have the new regulations that are coming into force. This year alone, we've had the MRV and the ballast water treatment conventions coming in. More paperwork. You look at the MRV, the amount of documentation that has to be collected and reported back into the European Union. It's excessive. It's more work that they have to do on board the ship. We have the 2020 limits coming up into force in a couple of years. We've had climate change, NOx and SOx. All of these add to additional procedures, which makes our systems bigger, bigger, and even bigger. I spent the early part of my career as an auditor for a classification society, and one of the pieces of advice I gave to most of the companies who went to audit is, great, you're adding all these nice new procedures in, but does anybody ever take any procedures out that are outdated or not applicable anymore? We don't. We just make them bigger. So how do we fix this? In Thome, we started a process of trying to reduce our safety management system, which had grown to a reasonable size, tried to decrease the amount of text by 50%. And that's quite a challenge. We want the documentation to be user-friendly. If you go on board a ship, you will see a load of documents in the master's office about that long. And funny enough, every time a seafarer joins a ship, they usually have to sign a piece of paper that says that they've read and understood the safety management system on board. I've seen some of these systems are 3,000 pages long. How is it possible to read and understand what's in those documents? They can't find things inside those documents. They've grown where people add on a document if they get a comment from say a vetting survey, from an oil majors audit, from a class audit. We simply add additional words into the documents. So how do the people on board find the information? How do they understand what they're supposed to be doing and when they're supposed to be doing it and who's supposed to be doing it? They have to look, apparently, through these 3,000 pages to find the page that refers to what they should be doing at that time. It's impossible. One of the other things that we've had now is digitization. In the old days, it was a manual like this. Now we have a computer, and they have to find it. One of the gripes I have is that many of the systems are not easy to navigate. Some of our seafarers, especially the older seafarers, even include myself in that category, find it very difficult to navigate your way through the modern IT systems. I'm a big fan of Apple, and you'll see the last slide I talk about Apple a little bit more. A very simple click and shoot. It's much simpler to find things, so what we're trying to do is make it logically ordered and easy to access and navigate. One of the things we hope to achieve is to have no more than 3 clicks to get to any part of the document that you need to see. We need to provide clear instructions across all organizational levels. We have to understand who needs to read these procedures. It's not just the master, although most people may say it's only the auditor that gets to read these. It's not. It has to go right down to the ABs, to the cook, to the messman. Everybody that's on board and everybody that's in the office should be able to read what's in these. So what's the procedure philosophy that we have? It's who does what and when. That's all that should be in there. A lot of the focus is on how. We've moved how into appendices. How describes, it's describing. It can be used by junior crew who are learning the ropes, but we have to understand that our fleets are manned by competent seafarers. Writing procedures does not help the incompetence that's on board. You can't address competence by writing a procedure. So if we think that we can bypass the competence on board by putting additional procedures, we're mistaken. And we looked at the simplicity, which is part of usability. And usability is generally accepted to include 3 characteristics. Firstly, readability. Secondly is legibility. And thirdly is comprehension. Seems very simple. So what is readability? It's a measure of the complexity of words and sentence structure. That means how many syllables are in a word? How difficult is the word to understand? And what's the length of the sentence? One of the toughest things, I think, to work out when you try to simplify a system is, everyone's aware of the SMART goals, and part of the SMART goals is measurable. How do you measure how simple a document is to read? Yeah, you can read it yourself, and you may think it's quite simple. I'm an engineer. I look at the engineering documents, and I think that's very simple to read. But if a master mariner or an AB or a wiper has to read the same document, is he going to think the same? So it has to be measurable. So how do we measure complexity and simplicity? There's several tests and tools which are commonly accepted. Most commonly used is something called the Fletch Reading Ease Test, and it gives a score from 0 to 100. There's also one called the Fletch Kincaid grade levels, which goes back to the US schooling system. Believe it or not, most people use Microsoft Word. It's not an advert for Microsoft, but you can actually find these tests in Microsoft, so I found out. So they're readily available in nearly all of the word processing documents tools that we have. Both of these can be used to determine how difficult a passage in English is to understand. We have to remember that on board ships nowadays we have many multinationals. We have, certainly in Thome, I think we have something like 6 or 7 different nationalities on our ships, of which very few English is their first language, if any. Here's some interesting facts, and we talk about the grading system. Along the bottom here, you can see the grades. So if you're reading Hemingway, for example, you can read that and comprehend it in grade 4. If you read a Stephen King novel, you're talking about a grade 8 level. New York Times is a year or grade 10. So if you've got halfway through your secondary school, you can read the New York Times. Typical law documents, year 13 or grade 13, that's pretty much university level. So you have to have had a university education to read a typical legal document. The one that always entertained me is the final one, the Times of India. As we all know, Indian seafarers are pretty prominent in the industry at the moment, and certainly in my part of the world in Southeast Asia, many of our superintendents are Indian nationals. They're the people writing our documentation. In the times of India, you have to be a grade 15, which basically means you almost have to be postgraduate, educated, to read and understand the times of India. Most of our seafarers that we come from India are well educated, taught, thank you to the British, under their system. They write very complicated words. I discovered when I came into our organization that some of the documentation used words I have never heard of. And English, believe it or not, is my first language. I may not be from England, but I do speak it as my first language. So it's very difficult for me to understand. So I think about a Croatian or a Russian, a Ukrainian or a Filipino AB trying to read some of this documentation is impossible. I don't know what the words mean, so they certainly do not. Just some facts here. If you look at what we aim to do, we aim to have a grade 8, maybe a grade 9 we can get away with, as an ideal target for the readability. So if you have a reasonable education level, sort of middle school, completed middle school, you should be able to read our procedures. Here's just an example of what we started with. This is a passage planning document that we had. And as you can see, the original document contained nearly 3,000 words. The readability was at grade 13 level. So again, a university education person could read that document quite comfortably. Anybody else? Not really going to happen.
In 1 minute.
So with the newly revised one, we reduced the wording, number of words, down to 966. So that's 1/3 of what it was previously. We reduced the level required down to 8.6. So if you came from 8th grade, 9th grade completed, you should be able to read and understand that document. Yeah. It's important that we make things on board the ships useful for our crew, and this is one way of doing it. I mentioned Apple, and this is someone I've always admired, Steve Jobs, and it's been one of my mantras, focus on simplicity. Simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple. And that's very true. It's very easy to write a complicated document, but it is quite complex to write a simple document. So I hope, if nothing else, that people look at their safety management systems, understand where the seafarers are coming from, and try and make it simpler for them to use. Thank you very much.